Today on Storytime, the third Samnite War, the final one. And you might want to go ahead and pause and write these things down. Got the dates, and then a couple people, well, one's a god, one's a person, that will become prominent in today's story. I apologize for the audio, by the way. I'm not filming in my normal location, but hey, you do what you're going to do, right? Okay, so if you guys remember, the previous two Samnite Wars, at the end of the second Samnite War, the Romans, of course, they had this territory already from defeating the Latin League in the Latin War. And then, I can't really tell what color this is, but I can see it's some kind of grayish color. This little thing that surrounds this other color is what the Romans got after the Second Samnite War. So you kind of see that they've surrounded the Samnites. So the Samnites are still pretty upset about how the Second Samnite War turned out for them. So what they decide to do is they decide to form an alliance with the Etruscans up here, also the Gauls way up here, like the Senones, for example, Brennus's tribe. And it's unclear whether or not they got the Sabines involved too. Possibly, the sources kind of differ. And they come up with this big alliance. They're like, you know what? We're just going to crush Rome, and we're going to actually make Rome fight a two-pronged war. And so shortly after the Second War ends, which was in the year, I think, 304, then boom, 298, the Third Samnite War begins. Now, for the longest time, like the first 5 years or so of the war, the Romans were doing fairly well, but they couldn't seem to sort of like close the deal with this war. And I'm going to skip some of the stories that are involved with them because they're a little bit repetitive from previous stories, and so therefore are probably not true. But at some point during this war, Gaius Pontius, the Samnite leader, is actually captured in battle, taken back to Rome, and executed. Now, in the year 293, in the city of Rome itself, there's a massive plague that breaks out, fitting for today's time. And the Romans couldn't figure out how to get rid of this plague, so they went to an oracle. And this is what the oracle said. The oracle said, hey, if you want to get rid of this plague, then you must institute the worship of Asclepius into the city of Rome. Now, Asclepius is the god of healing and medicine, and the Romans didn't know that much about him, so they sent a delegation over to a town in Greece to learn more about Asclepius. When they got there, and the priests were showing them around the temple, and because it's the god of healing, there was essentially like, I guess you could call it a hospital, not really, more like an area where it's sort of like a dormitory for people who are really sick, and they would go to the temple of Asclepius, and you would usually fall asleep in the temple after taking something that was usually drugged, and they would have strange dreams, and then they would get up in the morning and they would tell the priest, hey, this is what my dream was, and the priest would sort of help them figure out, like, oh, you know what Asclepius is telling you, that to get rid of your back pain, you must take all of these different herbs, etc., etc. So while they're being shown around, and they start making prayers, they are looking at how the Greek priests pray to Asclepius, and the Romans are kind of jotting it down and saying, oh, okay, this is what we have to do. While that's happening, a snake comes out of nowhere, big, huge snake, and just slithers very peacefully right past the Romans. And the Romans are sort of astounded, like, where'd this big snake come from? It goes right out of the temple, it goes down through the streets, and they're all just sort of staring at it, looking at it. And where does it go? It goes right on board the Roman ship. And the Romans are like, huh, well, maybe that's a good sign. So they get back on the boat, and they head back to Rome. Now, you guys remember, of course, that Rome is not on the coast itself of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Rome's seaport is Ostia. And boom, we get into the Tiber River here at Ostia. We're sailing up towards Rome when, and please don't ask me how, but so there's this island. It's called Tiber Island. It's right in the middle of the Tiber River. Please don't ask me how they figured this out, but somehow the snake started indicating to the Romans on the boat that it wanted to go ashore at that island. I don't know how the snake indicated that, but it did. So the Romans park the boat over here, and the snake immediately gets off the ship and slithers onto the island. Now at this point, there was nothing on this island but trees. And so the Romans decide, I think we should follow the snake. This is weird. So they get off the boat too. They go after the snake, and they can't find the snake anywhere. But what do they find? Boom. They find a statue of Asclepius, for you see the snake has turned into Asclepius, and at that exact spot, the Romans figure, hey, that's where we should build the Temple of Asclepius, which they do. And here's what it looked like back during classical times. And then here, of course, is what it looks like today. In today's Rome, there's a hospital on that site. How appropriate. So, boom, they have brought over the worship of Asclepius. Supposedly the plague then ends, and the Romans are good to go for the last few years of the war. Now, in the last year of the war, 290 BC, the Roman co-consul is a guy named Manius Curius Dentatus. He's called Dentatus because he supposedly was born with a full set of teeth. Dentatus essentially just means toothy, so that was his nickname, hence his cognomen. Now, he was a plebeian. He was noted for being very incorruptible and extremely frugal as well. So he presides over the last battle of the Samnite War, and it's very clear that the Romans are winning this battle. It's a multi-day battle. And so the Samnites start to think, gosh, you know what, we really need to go ahead and start figuring out some way for us to sign a peace treaty. We know that the Romans are going to own us, essentially, but we want to try and get some kind of favorable terms out of this. So they sent a delegation over to see Dentatus in his tent, and what these folks have done, these Samnites, is they brought a whole bunch of golden objects with them because they essentially want to bribe him in order to get more favorable terms. And how do they find the co-consul, the leader of the entire Roman army? How do they find him in his tent? They find him dressed very plainly and roasting a turnip over a fire. And you're like, huh, wow, we were expecting somebody to be very majestic and have on a big uniform and have a whole bunch of people attending to him. And what's this guy doing? Cooking his own dinner? And what is his dinner? It's just one turnip? And they came in and they introduced themselves and they started making all these offerings. And he basically just turns his hand to them and says, no, I want to keep roasting my turnip. And so he roasts his turnip and he eats it. And they're all just standing there like, oh my gosh, this guy doesn't want any of the things that we have. And finally, Dentatus looks at him and says, tell your people that I would rather give orders to the rich than be rich myself. Remember that I can neither be beaten in battle nor corrupted by money. Now go away. So the Romans loved this guy for that. Mr. Turnip Roaster, here's another depiction of it. And please don't ask me about all these people up here. What are they doing? I don't know. Where do they all come from? But here he is roasting his turnip. He's like, hey, I'm going to eat my turnip. Get away from me. So the Samnite War came to an end. All the Samnite Wars, actually. And just to go back, at the end of the Third Samnite War, boom, all of this area right here is under firm Roman control. Now, what does that mean? You could probably tell they seem to be expanding southwards rather than northwards. And so sure enough, shortly after this, boom, they're going to come in conflict with some of these Greek colonists down here in the south. And there's a man by the name of Pyrrhus, of Epirus, who's going to come ashore. And ooh, it gets dicey, that is for sure. Dentatus, by the way, keep him in your mind because he's coming back in our battles with Pyrrhus, and that is on the next episode of Storytime. Good night.